Hello and welcome to September. This is Fist-Ended Christians, and I'm your host, DJ, and my co-host is Dustin.
Hello.
We are here sitting in the feeling shed. It's been, when's the last time we did one of these?
A month ago?
Was it a month ago?
6 weeks?
Did that even record?
Oh, no. So, yeah, that one we didn't record because we had tech issues.
So, technically, it was been a month, but it was unfruitful in terms of being able to record.
Yes.
And so, in theory, or even in factual, it's probably been a couple months because summer always does that to us.
Yep.
So, anyways, welcome. We're blessed to be sitting in the feeling shed, and the sun's out, and we've had a great breakfast, and just getting caught up. Again, it's been a busy summer, and we were kind of trying to figure out what we want to talk about today. So I'm gonna kind of frame our topic today with a story that I was lucky enough to kind of experience this last weekend. So I was on a sailing trip, and the sailing trip was over, and we were sitting in the marina, and we were unloading the boats and just kind of farting around. It was a beautiful sunny day like it is out now.
Yep.
And there's these two young fellows, probably 17, 18,
Okay.
that we kind of started to spy on in their own sailboat. Now, I'm not sure if it was one that they rented or if they took out their dad's, but it was very clear very quickly they had no idea what they were doing.
Sure.
And like they were kind of, rubbing up against other sailboats because he couldn't figure out how to steer it and
Sure.
get the motor started. And so they were just floating around. And so I'm sitting here and I'm just kind of observing it more and more. And then other people started observing more and more. And then the captain of our boat started getting irritated.
Okay.
And he's like, oh, those guys better not hit my boat. They're getting close to my boat. And he was kind of nitpicking them.
Sure.
Like, oh, what are these idiots doing? And it was kind of negative. And it was kind of close-minded. And I'm like, God, like, what is, why are you being... He was really concerned about his boat. Like,
Sure.
too much so, I thought. And these guys finally start kind of motoring past us really slowly. And I look at them, and they both have huge smiles on their faces.
Sure.
They're so happy.
Yep.
They didn't know what they were doing.
Yep.
But they're heading out on Lake Superior
Yep.
on a Sunday afternoon with the weather is just gorgeous. And they were just happy. They
Yep.
were open to the fact that they were going to screw up.
Yep.
And so that's what I was thinking we could talk about today is openness and what that brings to people who are struggling with depression or anxiety or anger issues or even addiction is what is openness, and to you, Dustin, and maybe get your thoughts on that for us to start.
Yeah, so I think when we were talking earlier this morning over breakfast, you had like a good physical kind of analogy of what it means to be closed or open, and so it'll be a little hard to explain it probably without video, but basically you were saying like if you're dealing with any sort of mental health issues and you're closed off, it's like you have your arms wrapped around your chest and you're kind of hunched over and you're just trying to like block everything out.
Kind of fetal.
Yeah. And I think that's a very defensive way to live.
So,
it's
yeah.
constantly it doesn't allow for positive. It's only defensive, which is usually negative.
Right.
And so you're constantly thinking what bad thing is going to happen next. Things that do happen to you always have at least some negative connotation along with them, even if it is a positive. And so I think openness is accepting the positives, accepting what life can bring you versus life is going to crap all over me all the time and I have to be ready for it. And that keeps you focused on yourself, whereas openness keeps you focused on everything else out there. And it's really good for people with mental health issues to get focused on other things, not just themselves.
You basically verbatim just said what Alyssa said
Okay.
this last week. Exactly word for word.
Sure.
I kind of attribute it to, and I don't know, I've been this way where I've been so depressed and so down on myself and closed that I just stay in bed.
Sure.
You know, and I don't leave bed.
Yeah.
And the door's locked, the blinds are drawn. And what potential is there other than for me to marinate in my own stuff
Yep.
for openness? You know, I've used the word missed opportunities. I think when we're closed, we just are going to, just by default, we're going to miss opportunities. As opposed to, you know, not being in bed all day and not having the shades drawn and having the door open. You know, when you're looking at the world in that way, you're going to, by its very nature of openness, I think it's going to draw things to you.
Sure.
For example, door was open yesterday, windows were open. Neighbor Ron, Farmer Ron came over. Hey, you want 36 tomatoes? You know?
Sure.
And as a result of that, then he's like, well, maybe I'll go ask the neighbor. So then the neighbor, who I haven't met yet, you know, they came out, okay. And so then all of a sudden there was an exchange,
Sure.
a connection,
Yep.
maybe just a little connection, but a connection nonetheless.
Yep.
That wouldn't have happened. And no, maybe we'll call this 36 tomatoes, this podcast. There was this connection that was made that wouldn't have happened if I just decided, I'm not in the mood today to deal with anybody, so I'm just going to lay in my bed because it just seems better. And I feel like that can be an analogy for just our mindset in life, whether it be meeting new people or taking new risks.
Yeah.
That would otherwise benefit us, you know, success or failure. So I'm just thinking in terms of the openness. We talked a little bit about openness as it relates to some of the racism issues and some of that conversation that's going on in the world.
Yeah.
And I think there's a lot, and just even politics. You know, I think people in general are just closed off. Like you see all this social media stuff, and it just seems like people are attacking each other, and that doesn't feel like openness to me. It doesn't feel like there is everybody's so defensive because they don't want their minds to be changed.
Yeah.
You know, and I don't think that's healthy for us as a country.
No. I don't think it's healthy for us on any level, whether it's a country or a small group at church or a whole church or on an individual level. Whatever level, being closed off is not healthy. It leads to stagnation.
Mm-hmm.
That's a really big thing. It leads to us versus them mentalities,
Mm-hmm.
and humans have proven over 4 million years that we're better when we work together. And so one of the things that I like on Facebook that I'm trying to work towards when I post things is getting people to be able to criticize their own positions first and then see the other side's arguments. So I think there's something healthy about being able to be open to, well, what positions am I currently holding that could be wrong, and what positions is the other side holding that could be right, and analyzing that. And I think that allows, you had talked about over breakfast, openness is the only way to grow. Like, you can't grow when you're closed off. I mean, by definition, you're closed off. You're not seeking anything to expand anything. You're just like, this is my little world in this little box, and nothing's going to come in and nothing's going to go out, and, well, eventually that'll die. So you have to be open to grow.
Well, you just nailed biology.
Yeah.
if there's a flower that refuses to open itself up to the sun,
Yeah.
it's not going to grow. It's
Right.
going to die. If there's a fish that decides it's just going to hang out in its little hidey hole,
Yeah.
it's not going to grow.
Right.
It's going to starve.
Yeah.
It needs to eat.
Yeah.
So I think openness at its very core is a universal law that I think all too often we just sort of sideswipe a little bit because we don't, it's such a simple concept, but I think it's a really profound concept because I think it requires us to be intentional.
Yeah.
And it requires us to sort of, we have to choose that, right?
Mm-hmm.
Every day. And to choose being open means that you have to change your attitude. You have to change your mindset. You have to change maybe some conditioned thinking behaviors that happen in your mind that nobody knows but you.
Right.
And challenge those, right? And so you talk about, on Facebook and I love that, about, kind of figuring out what's wrong with my viewpoint, or at least being open to somebody else's opinion of what may be wrong with my viewpoint,
Yep.
and them doing the same. I think we have to do that in our own thinking, is challenge. And that requires self-awareness. And we talk about that all the time on our podcast, is that to grow, you have to take a very committed, intentional decision to be aware, to
Yes.
learn more about yourself. And I think, and it's funny, I don't know if we've been together, Dustin, since I went on my high school trip. But I have some high school buddies that came into town. I think we did talk about it, but that was the last podcast that had some tech issues. But they came into town, and we talked a little bit about kind of mindset and openness. And me and a friend were very intentional about creating activities that were out of the box kind of things that required people to be open.
Sure.
And at the end of that trip, the two other guys that are a little bit more conservative, maybe, if you will,
Sure.
not politically, but just kind of as their nature,
Yep.
they kept raving about all of the things that I had come up with
Yep.
that pushed them out of their comfort zone.
Sure.
So they grew. I mean,
Yep.
they might have grown in a silly way, right?
Sure.
They might have pushed themselves to put on a birch bark fire hat, right? They might have pushed themselves to get naked and jump off the dock.
Sure.
They might have pushed themselves to be vulnerable in a conversation with the truth totem. Okay,
Sure.
we had a truth totem, and if you were
Okay.
holding the truth totem and you were asked a specific question, you had to tell the truth.
Sure.
And you could call bullshit. And we did call bullshit a couple times, and
Okay.
then they had to go back around, and then they had to kind of like, okay, well, how often do you masturbate,
Sure.
right? And again, not everybody wants to be that way,
Right.
and not necessarily I need to know how often somebody masturbates,
Right.
but there's the strategy is to be open requires vulnerability.
Oh, yeah.
You know that. You experienced that recently.
Yeah.
You have to be vulnerable
Yep.
because we don't want to be rejected,
No.
and we don't want to be hurt.
Right.
So yeah, it's the same kind of premise too, of having a difficult time finding guests to come on the show, because as a white guy, or just as a male, okay, not necessarily anything to do with skin color, we talked about this on our guy trip too, is what does it mean to be a man? And it kind of was we talked about our podcasts, is men by their very nature have a hard time. And why is it so hard? What's the stigma of just opening up?
Yeah.
What's the stigma of kind of doing some self-exploration? Like,
Right.
what am I about?
Yeah.
What's holding me back? And we have a lot of men that I think in my work that are just super depressed, and they're angry and they're frustrated and they don't know why.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's interesting. I'd be curious to know if it's just some biological thing in males that makes them less open to exploring their emotions,
environment,
or if it's more environment, or if it's a mix of both. But that is one thing that, well, I think it's definitely more male driven, but even on a societal level, we've had a hard time, and it's getting better, of being open about mental health issues. For up until the last 10 years, if you were dealing with depression, or if you were dealing with anxiety or addictions, it was always something to like talk about in hushed tones. And there's the sitcom trope of, well, I don't want to go see a shrink, I'm not nuts. And it's like, well, you don't have to be nuts like in a psychopath or sociopath way to need help. I think a lot of people need help, and some people that's therapy, some people it's a hobby, some people it's volunteering. There's just something, again, being open to things outside of yourself. I think that's a big thing. Like, I've noticed with my mental health issues, and it's really hard to do sometimes because, like you said, you just want to sit in bed and shut the world out. But if I can force myself to go see some friends or to engage in a hobby, it's getting outside of my own head.
Do you feel a little bit better when you do those things? Sometimes?
I would say most of the time.
Yeah.
And it depends too on, there's, especially with the friends, I think you have to be careful because, like, I'll go hang out with friends that know me and understand me, and if I'm not, like, normally if I'm not super depressed, I'm a pretty engaging person and I like to laugh and have fun, but if I'm depressed, I don't necessarily want to do that. So hanging out with friends that understand, like, okay, in this moment, he's not going to want to laugh and joke, so let's just play a board game or build a puzzle or something, but it gets me around other people. So I think that's a very important thing, is getting outside of yourself, being open to other people and other experiences other than your own self and your own depression or your own anxiety or your own addictions, whatever it is.
Yeah, as you're talking, I have another story from the sailing trip that I think is perfect for this conversation. You kind of drummed it up. So I'm going to call him Jerry. Jerry is probably almost 40, and he's been a friend of mine for a long, long time, kind of through other friends, but whenever we get together, it's just like we're solid. But he holds the record, or he used to, I think it was broken recently, for the quickest through hike on the Superior Trail.
Oh.
Solo hike by himself. He did it like within, I don't know, he broke the record.
Yeah.
And he's just that kind of extreme guy.
Yep.
And so we're on the boat, and we're sailing on Saturday, so a week ago today. And he and I were up near the bow of the boat, and we just got to talking, and he started telling me that he's hushed tones. He's like, "Yeah, I'm decided to start seeing a therapist." And I'm like, "Really? Like, what's going on?" He goes, "I struggle with, like," he's married, 3 kids. I struggle with super bad anxiety, super bad depression, and he goes, "That's why I party all the time. I'm good at partying, and so he's on medication.
Okay.
He's going to a therapist, and he's starting to be a little bit more self-aware.
Sure.
So Saturday afternoon or early evening, he's a partier.
Okay.
He went out to the boat to get some stuff.
Sure.
And like they were going to get, because we were anchored, so you had to take a dinghy out to the boat and grab whatever you needed and then come back to the beach. And so he went out there with another guy that was on the trip, and when he came back, something was wrong.
Okay.
He went from being open earlier in the day to super closed.
Okay.
Okay? And he gets back to shore and he disappears. and I'm responsible for dinner. So I'm making food and getting the fire started and this and that, and just we're all hanging out. People are drinking beers.
Yep.
It's just a beautiful, beautiful setting. But Jerry's gone. And then after a while, he comes back and he's kind of shaking his head, and he's closed. He's like, "Yeah, guys, I just threw up," and you could tell something was really wrong with him.
Sure.
So I went over to him one time because he walked away and was laying on the beach by himself, and all the other four of us, were having a great old time talking. Like, "Oh, that's too bad." Jared says he feels sick to his stomach and he threw up, and so I went over him one time and I'm like, "Hey, what's going on? Are you?" And based on our conversation earlier, I'm like, "Are you having a panic attack or an anxiety attack?" And he goes, "Oh, I don't want to talk about it. I don't want to talk about it. It's embarrassing." So I'm like, "Okay." So I let him be.
Yep.
Went back to dinner, and then I don't know, maybe half hour, 45 minutes later, he was still closed. He was still off.
Yep.
And I went over, and this time he's shaking, like
Jeez.
physically shaking. He's like, "I'm so cold. I'm so cold." I'm like, "Jerry, what is going on?
Yeah.
Jerry, what's going on?" And he's like, "Yeah, I'm so embarrassed. I don't want Bill to know." And Bill is the father of he's the father of one of the guys on the trip.
Okay.
He's the captain of the boat.
Okay.
And he's like, "Yeah, I don't want Bill to know." I'm like, "Well, what?" He goes, "Yeah, I took an Oxycontin on the boat. I thought it might make me feel like." He goes, "But it was really strong, and I feel like I'm losing. His heartbeat was I was like, are you gonna? Do we need to call somebody?"
Right.
And once he was able to be vulnerable, within 10, 15 minutes, he slowly sauntered back to the picnic table.
Sure.
He sat down at the picnic table. He tried to drink a beer.
Sure.
But he was more engaged. There's so many points I want to make with this topic, with this situation, is that his attitude when he came back, it kind of screwed up the whole vibe.
Yeah.
Right?
Yep.
But when he was vulnerable and open to saying, "Hey, I made a bad decision. I took this drug when I didn't really need to take this drug.
Yep.
And it's kind of screwed up my jam.
Yep.
And now that now I'm not keeping it to myself. I'm telling somebody else, and it wasn't common knowledge. It was just something that I think he and I knew.
Yep.
And maybe Josh, his other friend, they're good friends. It got better from there. But the other point is that conditioned thinking led him to make a decision that put him in a position that put him in a closed-minded position. Because he was, like you said earlier, brilliantly, he was so focused on himself because of his choices that had physical ramifications. And it impacted everybody, and not it didn't ruin our night, but it impacted the energy. Right? That that's happening right now, millions, if not trillions of times all around us. Is these conditioned thoughts like, "Oh, well, I always drink, so I'm going to drink now, and and this happened to me. I'm going to drink so much that I'm going to throw up. I'm going to make an asshole out of myself, and the next day I'm not going to do a thing. I'm going to feel super ashamed, super guilty. I'm going to stay in my house for 2 or 3 days." And so there's 2 or 3 days of missed opportunities, missed connections, because of our own shit. So openness is critical, I think, if we're going to be, strong, God-following men.
Yeah, there's a lot to think about there, but again, depending on the, how many or who you're around, I've never regretted being around good friends. No matter how depressed I was, if I could force myself to be around friends that I trust and who know me, I never left at the end of the day or the night thinking, "Oh man, I should have stayed home. I should have just wallowed in my own pity and all that."
Ah, it's so good.
Yeah. And so I think it's very important to be open to, like, to tie it back to what you said earlier about the 36 tomatoes, like, be open to new possibilities. Be open to having a conversation.
Could change your life.
It could. And there's no issue or problem if you get into the conversation, you're like, you know what, I just don't have the energy for this.
Mm-hmm.
There's nothing saying you can't just end it,
Mm-hmm.
but at least try it.
Mm-hmm.
Be open to trying that conversation, because you don't know what could come of it. It's doing nothing about something isn't going to make it better. So do something. Be open to some possibility that it can get better.
And this podcast is basically a physical manifestation of our intention to be open.
Yeah.
There's a young woman in my life who kind of has this phobia of throwing up all the time. And we take our experiences, and I think that God wants us to share those with others, right?
Yeah.
The bad ones and the good ones.
Yes.
But kind of the bad ones too,
Yep.
right? And so this young girl, teenage girl, has suffered with this phobia of throwing up to the point where she can't function. She doesn't want to leave the house. Am I going to throw up, Mom? Am I going to throw up? And I witnessed this. I know exactly what she's talking about.
Okay.
And so I went to her, and this is a while ago. I went and I'm bringing it up in a second. I'll tell you why I'm bringing it up again. But a while ago, I went to her and said, you know what, sweetheart? Like, I know exactly how you feel, because I used to get that way too all the time. And I used to worry I was going to throw up in weird social situations and just, And so let me ask you this. Whenever you felt anxious that you were going to throw up, how many times have you thrown up?
Sure.
And she got quiet, and she's like, none.
Yeah.
And then that was it.
Yeah.
And so a week or so ago, and it's been like a year or two, a week or so ago, we were sitting down sharing a meal, and this young woman, out of the blue, brings that up. She says, you remember that time that you shared with me that you felt the anxiety of throwing up, and then you asked me how many times I've thrown up when I feel that way?
Yeah.
And I'm like, yeah. And she says, that changed everything for me.
Okay.
She still gets it a little bit.
Sure.
But you know what she does is she thinks, well, how many other times have I thrown up when I'm having a panic attack or anxiety attack? None.
Yeah.
So it's not going to happen now.
Right.
And that's so she can get through it. My point is that we have so many opportunities to be open with ourselves to others so they don't feel like they're alone. You said when you're depressed, it always helps when you're out with friends.
Yeah.
And God, I hope those are friends that understand Dustin in a way that Dustin, you know what? If you want to be depressed and just sit over in the corner, we're just watching a movie anyways. I know you have a penchant for getting depressed and stuff, but I'm just super glad you're here. Are you okay? Yeah, I just want to be left alone. Like there's that acceptance, and the friends are being open to saying, hey, I understand where you're coming from. It's got to make you feel better. It's got to.
Yeah, it absolutely does. And the fact that they're open to having me there when I'm not at my funnest or my best,
right,
is very helpful. So I think it's, I think it's important to, well, I just shared this thing on Facebook. I don't know if you saw the Winnie the Pooh post.
I did. I didn't look at it.
Okay.
I was just scrolling.
Okay, so it basically it's Piglet and Pooh go to visit Eeyore because they haven't seen him in a few days, and Eeyore just says, "I'm sad and lonely and not very fun to be around," and so Piglet and Pooh decide just to sit with him in silence because that's what you do as friends, and Eeyore felt just a tiny bit better. And so I like the story was there, but then I wrote something before it, and I just ended it with, be kind and patient. You never know who you're helping, or something like that. And I think that's really important. Excuse me, really important. On the flip side is, if I need to be available to my other friends with depression, and like it's not just me that deals with depression. Other people can get depressed, or other people can have anxiety. And so I need to not only be open to seeking out friends when I'm feeling depressed, but I need to be open to having friends be able to come to me when they're depressed or anxious or dealing with drug addictions, whatever it is. So I think being open both ways is important, and incredibly beneficial. And I think that's a very Christ-like way to live. And I think, obviously, as fist-dented Christians, we're always trying to look more like Christ. So I think that's a very good way to live. And I think that it applies, obviously, to people. You don't have to be a Christian either. The benefits are clear of being around people. Science and psychologists back that up. So always be open to possibilities.
I kind of think Jesus was a great scientist.
Yeah.
I think Jesus had his finger on the pulse of universal law.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, well, I think that's going to be it for this week, and we'll finish with a prayer. And so I just ask the Lord to come into your life today and to fill your heart and your mind with openness and with self-awareness, in the ability to let Christ work through you, or let the Spirit or your higher power or your Creator to work through you today, so that you might be able to get out of your own way and just be filled with the Spirit that surrounds us all at all times. That's loving, it's giving, it wants the best for us. It wants us to know Him just more and more each day. And we know that we can only do that if we are open, and if we take risks, and if we push ourselves out when we don't necessarily want to. We know that we're still loved if we don't succeed. There are going to be days, Lord, where we just maybe fall short of your glory, but we know you still love us, and so please help us still love ourselves when we are that way. Bless our day today. Bless all the listeners that might be listening to this episode of 36 Tomatoes, and may you enjoy the long Labor Day weekend wherever you are. In His name we pray. Amen.
Amen.